G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to talk about rotator cuff strength exercises. And more specifically, I want to talk about why the traditional commonplace rotator cuff strength exercises shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of your rotator cuff strengthening regime. Because personally, as a PT or as a physio, I tend to find that the general rotator cuff strength exercises are limited in terms of their scope to apply to maybe elite athletes or elite sport or elite activities. They certainly have a really strong place in a lot of basic initial shoulder rehab, but then there comes a point where you might reach the ceiling of those exercises relatively quickly. So before we get to this, obviously if you do go to enjoy the video, please consider leaving a like rating down below. Consider subscribing to the channel if you're new. If you like this type of content, if you find it helpful, it's a great way to support the channel, but also be notified as these videos come out. But more importantly, let me know in the comments down below if you have a go-to rotator cuff strength exercise that you like, whether you're just an everyday person who is just doing their best to improve their shoulder function, whether you're in the industry and you have a whole specialized set of rotator cuff strength exercises. I'd really love to know in the comments down below. It's a great way just to pick each other's brains and figure out if there's anything that we're missing, so we can keep layering on top of layers and adding more pieces of information to make the information that we provide even more sort of interesting and special. So with that being said, when I'm talking about the initial rotator cuff exercises, I'm essentially talking about an exercise where traditionally you'll see a TheraBand or resistance band of some sort or a cable where you have the tension going sort of horizontally away, and you're essentially either rotating outwards from a good posture with your elbow in at your side, or if the resistance is going that way, coming back inwards for an internal rotation. And the idea behind this obviously is that we know that the rotator cuff attaches from the shoulder blade into the tip of that shoulder. And there's some at the sort of the front of the shoulder blade relative to where we're looking that rotates you inwards, and there's a whole bunch at the back that rotates you outwards. So it makes perfect sense that we formulate some exercises to, again, tap into that sort of physiology and fatigue those muscles to the point where they get stronger and they help sort of stabilize and support that motion better. Now, obviously, these exercises are best for anyone sort of post-operative who needs to reclaim some of that basic activation and strength in their rotator cuff. Also for someone who's maybe had a dislocation or subluxation where increased stability of that shoulder has become paramount. Maybe you have a labral tear and there's a little bit of sort of active instability there, and you need to sort of tighten that up a little bit with some increased strength and stability through those rotator cuff exercises. It's completely understandable. The point I wanted to make with this video is that there will come a point where those exercises reach their ceiling. And there'll come a point where this particular movement isn't functional enough for you to progress to an elite state. Obviously, we can sort of progress the resistance and add more resistance to make that stronger for you. We can then take you into a position where you're more in this range, which again is perfect for a swimmer, for a thrower, for a tennis player, for a lot of bat and ball sports, for example. However, we also need to evolve our thinking in terms of how the shoulder functions as a whole. And the purpose of this video for me is that I want to make sure that we have a really mature conversation surrounding the function of the shoulder. And we know that your shoulder complex and your body as a whole, it doesn't function as isolated muscles working independently of each other, which is sort of the impression that we give people, because a lot of the exercises that we give, particularly rehab exercises, are very isolated. You might do some strict bicep curls, some strict internal, external rotation. You might do some diagonals or some horizontal extensions or whatever it might be. But we don't necessarily then take you to the point where we get you to ask your body to use all these muscles together at the same time to not only stabilize that shoulder, but drive normal shoulder motion. So the exercise that I want to promote is a very, very simple one. And this can be done by anyone at any stage of their rehab. Obviously, post-operative care, just need to make sure that you check with your doctor or your physical therapist or your physiotherapist to make sure that it's the right time to do this. But at some point, this exercise will be highly effective for anyone. Even if you don't have shoulder pain and you just want your shoulders to function better. What I really like to do with this is we want to basically turn your shoulders into hips. And what I mean by that is, when you're looking at your shoulders, you have your rotator cuff, you have your scapular stabilizers. They're considered the things that sort of the glue that holds your shoulder together, the foundation that normal movement is based upon. Similarly with the hip, we have a set of rotator cuff muscles in the hips that are the external rotators. There's a number of them, including the piriformis, which a lot of people have heard of. They're basically attached from your pelvis into your thigh bone, and allows us to rotate in a lot of different directions. We can also create external rotation stability at that hip by rotating our legs out with our feet straight to support a stable hip so we can move up and down. Now the shoulder's a little bit different in the shoulder blade really means that we have a hip on wheels, so that hip joint can slide around the body to improve the amount of range we have access to. But essentially, if we were to cement that in place and just look at the shoulder itself, that rotator cuff is very similar to the hip external rotators. And those hip external rotators tend to function really well together because we're always on our feet, we're always asking those muscles to activate in unison and not individually while we're walking or standing or running or dancing or whatever. So what we can actually do is we can take a leaf out of that lower limb book and then turn our shoulder strengthening into something where our hands are on the ground or on a surface to really engage a lot of the muscles and ask them to function together. So the way that I like to start with this is, for most people, it's best to do this on your bed or on a chair or a table that's not going to move. I'll do it on the ground, obviously, because it's much easier for the sake of the video, but what we want to get you to do is as soon as you place your hands on the ground and put any type of weight through them, every single muscle in your shoulder is forced to activate. So if we can apply some basic principles to that to make sure that you're focusing on the right muscles activating in the right position, we can suddenly take your rotator cuff strengthening regime to a whole nother level that traditional rotator cuff strength exercises just don't target or don't sort of achieve. So the way that we need to do this is we can basically do a simple push-up position. So what I like to get my patients to do is we want your hands straight. So we don't want your hands out or in, hands straight. We want to get you to take your shoulder blades back. So again, we're essentially trying to cement them to the back of your upper back. And what I want you to do here is instead of letting your elbows, which we'll traditionally want to roll outwards, we actually want them to rotate inwards. And what we want to see here is when you're in this position and you rotate those elbows around, you should feel the muscles in your shoulder activate and stabilize. So that if you have your shoulders back, so you set the scap stabilizers and the muscles around that, elbows sort of rotated in with your hands straight, as soon as you get into this push-up position, so again, whether this is on the ground or whether this is up onto something, you should really feel like all of those muscles start to engage. So obviously, if you're in the early stages of some sort of rehab, you might find that 10 seconds or 20 seconds or sets of that might be more appropriate for you to fatigue you, and then as the car drives past, to fatigue you in a really respectful way. There should never be any shoulder pain. So if you're doing this and you feel like it starts to become uncomfortable, it's very, very likely that you've lost a good shoulder posture. So instead of being in a position where your shoulders are back, your elbows are rotated in, everything's stable, you might find that that shoulder will start to tip forward, or you'll lose that shoulder posture in a way that you really need to pull back and make the exercise a bit easier before you get to that. Now, obviously, as you get better at this, then we can start to lower you down. So if you start on a couch or a bed or a table, with your hands on the table, we can get you to lower yourself down eventually until you get to a point where you're doing a push-up position on the floor like a surgery. And then if you're someone who wants to take this to another level, we can actually start taking you further up the other direction. So essentially what I sort of aim for a lot of my younger, more athlete-specific patients is we want to eventually get you to the point where you're doing a handstand up against a wall, really challenging your mobility through your shoulder, but also trying to get those muscles to stabilize with quite a lot of weight going through them. So if you feel like you're at the point where a push-up for a minute is probably too easy for you, then put your feet up onto a chair, then try and put it up onto a table, then eventually try and throw yourself up into a handstand up against the wall, and you'll feel a huge amount of benefit and a huge amount of increased function, because all those muscles, provide that you're in a good posture, you're using good mechanics and good technique, that should then make sure that you take your rotator cuff strengthening to the next level. So it may sound a bit strange that a handstand is a really, really useful shoulder rehabilitative exercise for the rotator cuff. But if you're doing it in a good position, the more load you're putting through that, just as a respectful scaled position for you that's appropriate for you, then you can start to make some really, really powerful inroads into someone who chronically subluxes a shoulder, dislocates a shoulder, maybe you've got that labral tear that's causing some instability, like I said. Obviously, initially post-op, a handstand is going to be too much for most people, but 6 months down the track, when you're really starting to reclaim all that basic, that really sort of high level function, if you've ticked off all the progress towards that, there's no reason why you can't attempt that, provided you've been given the tick of the approval by the people that matter, the people that you care about, whether that's your physio, your doctor, your PT. But as I said, I just wanted to make that an interesting sort of connection there, because in the industry, we tend to be very reliant on rotational based exercises because that's what the rotator cuff does. But because that's not a movement that we do a lot in isolation, there's a lot of stuff that happens together, and your tissues don't function as individual muscles, they function as a system within the system and functions as a whole. You need to make sure that at some point you are addressing that down the line. So as I said, the traditional rotator cuff exercises absolutely have a place. They're really good for a lot of people, but at some point they're not going to be good enough to take you to more elite levels of function. So with that being said, I hope that was really helpful. If it was, let me know down below. Again, I want to hear what your go-to rotator cuff strength or shoulder stability exercise might be. Please leave a like rating down below. Consider subscribing, and then we'll see you in the next one.